We tend to forget how recent the whole AI wave is. Like ChatGPT is literally 3 years old, right? I started sort of researching this book much before that. I started talking to people, and I think 100 interviews in, I realized that I just managed to speak to some super high level people, like the chairman of Google, for instance, like John Hennessy, last year's Nobel Prize winner in physics, Jeffrey Hinton, so many Turing Award winners that I've forgotten the count. People in South Korea who are central figures in their tech industry. And so when I hit 100 interviews, then I realized that I think I'll need to figure out a way to make these interviews a very central part of the book. Otherwise, I'm not optimizing for the material that I have.
If you were to, let's say, come up with those 103, oh wow, I didn't know this moments for you, what were those for you?
I mean, the whole thing. Like, I would say that when I started writing the book, I did not have a sense of any of it. Like, I had a sense of direction, but I just, like, even for China, for instance, I think even today, people don't have a very good sense of the amount of change that is coming from China right now. I think an average person, I mean, if they read the book, then sure, but like an average person wouldn't know that 7 out of 10 EVs in the world are Chinese. And it's not just that they produce some of the cheapest or the most number of EVs, but that they produce some of the best EVs out there as well. The Xiaomi SU7 that just came out recently would be a case in point. So I think China consistently surprised me. And to find that in an area like AI, a country like China, half the talent in the world is coming from there, that was really surprising for me. I thought I would say that the typical stuff that you hear about China, which is the US is very good at setting up ladders, China is really good at climbing it, US is really good at going from 0 to 1, China is really good at going from 1 to 100. But the basic research that we're seeing coming from China, especially in frontier disciplines like AI, I think that really surprised me. And I think the other thing that really surprised me is the massive gap between these two countries and the others. There's literally no other country or region out there, like even at the level of a continent, like all of Europe or whatever, that you could look at and say that they have competence in areas of technology that is as broad and as deep as what is happening in the US and China. The gap between these two places and the others is so massive. Like, just NVIDIA alone is worth multiples of the entire Indian GDP. It's multiples of the entire Japanese GDP. Like, it would be a top 5 economy in the world just, based just on its own market cap. And it's not the only $1 trillion company in the US. Then there's Google, then there's Meta, and all the others. And again, if you're a person who was concerned about the levels of inequality that you saw in the world in the past sort of 80 odd years, then good luck with the next 80, because the tech industry will be every other industry. And you already see that so vividly in the EV industry, for instance, where the old players have just been completely upended by companies that we initially saw as tech companies, which then just took over this entirely new industry. But the interesting thing about China is that all the Chinese people from the US who went back thinking that they were smarter than everyone else, it's not like they didn't have the idea to start their own Alibaba or their own sort of eBays or their own ride-hailing services. The interesting thing about China is that their tech economy was won entirely by locals. Like, it is not the people who returned from abroad. They work in the tech industry as workers, but they're not the successful entrepreneurs. So even over there, like, a layperson would have this idea that, oh, of course, you go to the US to learn the way that they do things over there, and then you come back and you do the same thing in your home country. That is not how China's tech industry was built. It was built by people who had very little exposure to the US.
During your research, was there ever any point which that made you think about Pakistan? Okay, maybe, I know from Pakistan's context, they could do really well.
Most prominently, if I would think about it, it would be more in terms of the gap that's opening up. Countries like Romania, for instance, where, again, it's not covered in the book, but there's a case study of UiPath in there, which was the biggest tech company to come out of Europe at that point in time. When it went public, it was at a valuation of 36 billion. It came from Bucharest, the guy who started the company. He learned programming without even having a computer. He learned it by reading programming manuals and not having hands-on experience with programming. And just the idea that the typical excuses that one can have, which is the environment is not conducive or government policy is not there. There are all sorts of exceptions to that, where you do see companies coming from the randomest places, which make it big globally. And so I think if I did think about Pakistan very frequently, it was more that, number one, there's a big gap. The gap that was already there is becoming much wider. And B, there's no reason why something of this scale cannot sort of come from there. If the closest analog that we often have is India, and having sort of been to Indian universities, having had that sort of very intimate experience, and having had that experience in LUMS, and then being familiar with places like NUST and FAST, etc., I don't think at the university level the gap is that big, especially when it comes to talent and all of that. In fact, I sometimes wonder, I'm not making a statement, I sometimes wonder whether in South Asia, LUMS is competitive as the best university in the region. Quite simply, if you go to an IIT, how it would present visually would not be like LUMS, right? I mean, LUMS would look much more refined to you. But they train a talent that is globally competitive at the IITs. And so, and India has over 100, companies that are worth over $1 billion, and Pakistan at this point, I'm not familiar with any. So, yes, just the question of, why not, and what it might take to have one soon.
What is your take on what are those elements and how each can play a role?
On a more abstract level, I think one of the benefits of having a study like this, which is moving beyond US, which is a heavily studied place to look at why innovation happens, looking at more places, is to precisely answer that question. What are the starting conditions? What do other countries need to do in order to sort of be more like them? For every rule that we thought existed, there is an example out there that disproves that. Again, there just was this assumption always that in the minds of people still now is, the way that innovation happens is that old companies get cannibalized by new ones, which is why Xerox and Raytheon and IBM are no longer there, and they all get replaced by new ones. But if you go to a place like South Korea, all the innovation is still happening in older companies like the Samsungs and the Hyundais, etc. And people also have an assumption that you really need to focus on one thing and get really, really good at that. And the benefits of just optimizing in that sort of niche, building better mousetraps. Samsung is in every business, from building roads to making smartphones to you really look at Samsung, which after the book you must have heard about it like just way too much. Look at Xiaomi, which is, it makes vacuum cleaners, and it makes what is arguably the best car under $50,000 in the world today, which is the SU7, which everyone's now talking about, smartphones, etc. So I think it really shows you that there are no starting conditions and there are no rules. And for every rule that you throw out there, I can show you an exception to that. We tend to think about, when we think about, how all of this happens, which is, we need to have those foundational conditions, like spend a lot of money in venture capital, have, the governance, have the old companies. With Canada, the AI thing is 3 people. Now it's more, but in the catalyst for it, the initial, how it started, is just literally 3 people. And again, that ought to give a lot of people, not just in Pakistan, but in a lot of other countries like it, a lot of hope that, you don't need 1 million people who are punching at a global level. Sometimes it's just about retaining those 4 or 5 that are really going to make a huge difference.